Well, the mainstay of this channel has been covering a lot of different topics, but the main ones have been true crime, fandoms, and the actual texts or objects that they're obsessed over. And good or bad, clearly a part of the Wheel of Time fandom has been really obsessed over the Amazon adaptation, which let us get right to it. Let's not stretch out the headline. Apparently, it is officially canceled. So, Wheel of Time has had 3 seasons, and the third one apparently will be the final one. So, I'm a little bit torn on this because I am a Snyder Cut supporter. I'm not going to get into the whole intricacies there about what fans should support or should not support, but it is pretty interesting how this does parallel the Snyder Cut movement in a lot of ways. But let us get to the nitty gritty. What happened? Well, apparently, Wheel of Time was doing good in the ratings. In fact, apparently, it was doing a little bit better than Jack Reacher, which is, to me, much better and much more popular. But apparently, in terms of the ratings, Wheel of Time was doing very respectable numbers. However, Wheel of Time is a fantasy shows, and fantasy shows tend to be really expensive, really expensive. And this was a large cast. It's not Game of Thrones, right? Game of Thrones was one of the most expensive shows, and it had a massive cast. So this is kind of apples and oranges, but still, when you do fantasy, it's hard to avoid big budgets because it is fantasy. So you have to just do a lot with costumes, locations, so on and so forth. I'm not even going to touch upon the very, to put it mildly, rancorous discussion of whether Wheel of Time is even any good. There's clearly a lot of division by the hardcore Robert Jordan fans, which I'm not, but to them, none of this was canonical, none of this was good, so I'm sure they don't care. They're like, good, fine, it's canceled, we're moving on, I don't care anymore. But the people who did love the show are really going into a spiral of outrage and anger. And being slightly naive to this whole thing, I didn't quite understand this, and I want to be very fair that there are some channels I have no doubt that really do care about Wheel of Time. But without any doubt, some of these channels clearly were hoping that Wheel of Time continuing as a TV series was going to be essentially a career for them and that it would be enough to get a sustainable income and basically just become a second job and perhaps a full time job for them. And they were getting exclusive interviews, talking with cast, so on and so forth, hanging out with Rosamund Pike, the whole thing. So it's a little bit silly to say that this is just a disinterested fan base. No, a lot of fans clearly have an investment, a financial investment, literally a personal financial investment in the show continuing and the show doing well. So they were just doing propaganda for the show. Again, were they uncritical? No, they were critical of some aspects, but clearly it was meant to be a very positive assessment of the show. And I just have to look at the numbers that the channels that were more critical actually were much bigger and larger. And again, I'm not necessarily sticking up for those channels. I have my own disillusionment with these channels as well, that they are hypercritical about some things, but not hypercritical about other things. So they have their own agenda. I'm just saying it's a very mixed bag in terms of the way this was presented. Now, the way I understood it, this was a popular series, but I also have to be brutally honest that some people were saying, oh, yeah, those Wheel of Time books they were just like pancakes. They were just selling like crazy. That is not my experience, guys. That is just not my experience. I saw it myself. I've been to a few bookstores. I just casually did keep an eye out whether people were going crazy for Wheel of Time, and the answer is no, right? That just wasn't happening. Now, that was not happening for both sides, right? Lord of the Rings had the same issue where Rings of Power came out with their own covers. They weren't disturbing the text, but they had clearly Amazon covers, and the idea was to market this version of Lord of the Rings. I didn't see people going crazy for those things either, at least not the area I'm from. And I've been to the smaller bookstores and the larger ones. I'm just not seeing that. I'm just not seeing that. So maybe it's true for these channels where they live. That's totally legit. Maybe where they were around, people were honestly going crazy for Wheel of Time. But I just did not see that. So I'm sure this fandom is real. I'm sure it is a large fandom. Wheel of Time has sold millions and millions of copies, and this is a massive series. We're talking like 15 books in totality, right? And technically, they're not all by Robert Jordan, right? It's Brandon Sanderson. So this is a huge fan base. However, it is not Game of Thrones, right? This is not Lord of the Rings. I don't even think this is Stephen King. Like, I love Stephen King's The Dark Tower. That's a really interesting fantasy series. Again, we can't get into the deep dive about what it's all about. It's a very intriguing series. It doesn't sell well, right? Same thing. It's a very passionate fandom. I'm a part of that fandom. I'm a Dark Tower fanatic and everything. However, I do recognize this is a small fandom. So I think the problem here is that, yes, the brand of Wheel of Time is popular, it is recognizable, but it's not at that Star Wars level. Because Andor ran into the same problems where at the very beginning, the episodes were just not getting a lot of traction. And I'll be totally brutal that the first couple episodes are not that good. They're not that good. However, if you do see the entire season, right, all of season two, it is much stronger. And even people who didn't like Andor are admitting now the ratings are getting really strong. But again, that's because we have a big brand name attached to it. This is a large fandom, and if it wants to be served, so be it. But it has to recognize that, you may not be in that stratosphere of Star Wars. I mean, Andor struggled, and it had the Star Wars brand. So I think the fandom is not being, quote, critical of itself, noting that, yeah, we're big, but we're not like massive. So, what is the status, and can the show be revived? I mean, it is possible, it has happened. So, the hope is that HBO or Apple TV will continue the series. The actual rights here are owned by Sony. So, the question is whether Sony will want to continue Wheel of Time. And that's going to be something for the Sony Corporation to determine. But I gotta be honest, I just don't think the outlook is good because, again, fantasy is really expensive. Why would they continue doing it? I mean, obviously, they're not going to continue the series because they're just not gaining enough with subscribers or with the potential audience. So they're not going to continue the series. And a lot of them are very passionate, saying they're canceling their Prime membership. They're no longer going to support Amazon, which they are free to do. But again, we're going to have to wait a while before we can assess that Amazon is really scared, saying, oh, wow, we really lost a massive part of the fandom. Maybe they did, or maybe they didn't. And this is just a very obvious business decision saying that it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it for the cost to get this potential audience, right? In terms of everything they get with it, a merchandising empire, right? Licensing rights to other regions. It's just not worth it. Now, for my part, I do feel sorry for the cast, especially for Josh. I think in the lead role as Rand, I think he gave a very spectacular performance. I think he was very sincere. I also feel sorry for Daniel as well, who played Lan. But at the end of the day, again, we have to assess carefully what did happen and did not happen. And again, aside from Rosamund Pike, this did not have a lot of big names attached. It just did not. It also just is not culturally as popular as Game of Thrones. I mean, listen, people were just going crazy calling their kids Daenerys, and it was just a wildfire. I mean, I've plowed through so many George R. R. Martin interviews. I mean, the thing is massive. Even if you don't care about Game of Thrones, people know the name of the characters. They know the major stories. They know who George R. R. Martin is. I mean, Winds of Winter is going to be a massive event if it ever gets published. Which I think is going to be soon, by the way. And again, Robert Jordan just doesn't have that cachet. He has a large fandom, but it's not at that size or intensity. But we're going to have to wait and see if the movement to get back Wheel of Time is going to work. For my part, I think it's a very mixed record. The outlook is not too good, but I do support the Snyder Cut, so I want to be consistent. So I will keep a lookout. But at this moment, it does feel like Wheel of Time, at least that version of the books, is gone and dead. And we're going to have to move on to something else, at least for now.